First of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation to this conference. Of course, I had been looking forward to meeting you all in person and to some lively discussions, perhaps at a Heurigen, but now virtual is the new normal. And so I'm excited to present our work on social and cognitive aging in non-human primates in this format. It's well known that we are facing dramatic demographic changes globally. According to this UN World Populations Report, by the year 2050, people aged over 60 will outnumber adolescents and young adults globally. And the ratio of the working population to the population 60 years and older decreases from 4:3 to 2. And these demographic changes have massive implications for the societies we live in. It concerns the workplace. How do we organize work? It concerns the healthcare system and the care system and how we finance it, and how we develop the living conditions for older persons in our society so that they can retain a high degree of independence into old age. All of this has sparked enormous research interest in different fields, including, of course, the health sector, cognitive decline, but also well-being. One of the determinants of well-being is social support. Social support is also a predictor of survival. In a landmark study, Holt-Lundstad and colleagues have shown that being embedded in a close-knit social community decreases the risk of mortality as dramatically as quitting excessive drinking or smoking. One consistent finding is that the social network of people shrinks with increasing age. This graph here shows the number of members in people's social networks for different age classes and for different categories of social partners. So close friends, family, neighbors, and others. And what this study here by Bruyne de Burin from 2020 shows is that people have really extended networks when they're younger than 30, and then still quite a sizable network in their working age, and then a shrinkage once people typically retire in the 60s and then 70s. So on the one hand, yes, overall social networks get smaller, but when you look at the really important partners, family, neighbors, and close friends, these numbers remain quite stable. And so it seems very clear that it's not the absolute number of people you're associated with, but rather the quality of the social relationships that people are able to maintain. Quality matters, obviously, beats quantity every time. Even into old age. So when people in old age report that they are feeling they're having a number of high quality relationships, highly valued partners, then they also report still a higher life or a higher life satisfaction. And this fits very nicely with theoretical considerations, above all socio-emotional selectivity theory, or SST, which had been advanced by Laura Carstensen and extended together with colleagues. And here, a key ingredient of the theoretical considerations is that people that are aware of their limited future time perspective tend to focus on meaningful activities and social partners in old age. So once people are increasingly aware that they're not going to live forever and the time is running out, if you will, that lets them shift the activities and also the choice of social partners and favor meaningful and valued, hanging out with valued friends over, making new acquaintances, for instance. A related body of theory is the strength and vulnerability integration model, which is also has been put forward to explain why people report overall a higher life satisfaction when they're older. And according to this model, older adults are more adept at choosing and shaping interactions so that they avoid stressful situations or unpleasant interactions. So there is a greater capability of regulating one's social life, and therefore ultimately one can report a higher life satisfaction. So here, on the one hand, the insight into one's limited future time perspective, but also metacognitive abilities are key ingredients in the theoretical considerations that have been put forward to explain why older people still or actually report a higher life satisfaction. To test this, how much is metacognition and higher cognition compared to more generally shared biological processes, we took a comparative perspective to examine changes, age-related changes in social, motivational, and cognitive abilities across the lifespan. And in this way, we aim to test some predictions from social selectivity theory and the SAVI model in monkeys of different ages. And the species of choice here were Barbary macaques. So here you see Barbary macaque females of 3 different ages. On the left-hand side is a young mother. She's 5 years old. And in the middle is a middle-aged female around 15 years of age. And on the right-hand side is a really old trooper. This female was 31 at the time when I took that picture here. And we ran a number of different and complementary studies. We looked at changes in sociality in males and females. We looked at variation in social interest in relation to age, processing of social information, how that varied with age, the exploration of novel objects, and executive control. And these studies were all parts of 2 PhD projects, namely by Laura Almeling and Eva Maria Radke, who really drove these studies, and without whom I would have nothing to tell you today, because they really put in all the hard work here. And non-human primates, in our view, are interesting because, as far as we know, they do not know that they're going to die one day. They do not seem to have an insight into a limited lifetime. There are also no cultural conventions in relation to how somebody ought to behave when they're old. And as you probably all know, this may play a great role in different cultures, although there's also malleability. My mother always says she's so happy she doesn't have to behave old anymore. But certainly in cultures, in human cultures, there are cultural conventions how people are expected to behave in different age classes. And we don't see this in non-human primates. Moreover, non-human primates, being members of the same order as us, namely the primates, share a similar physiology. One notable difference is perhaps that they don't have menopause. Of course, there are also differences when we study humans and non-human primates. In humans, most of the studies relied heavily on self-report data, whereas we're using observations and field experiments. And this is our study site, La Forêt des Singes in Rocamadour in France. It's a beautiful 20-hectare large enclosure. And in this enclosure, there are 160 monkeys, more or less, and living in 3 stable social groups. Barbary macaques are female bonded, so females may remain in the natal group, whereas males tend to disperse, and they actually can do this in the park. So we see males switching between groups, whereas females remain in the natal group. And at this point, I want to thank Ellen Mertz and Gilbert de Durkheim for the permission to work in the park. And it has been a pleasure over the many years to always return to Rocamadour, and I look forward to going back. Last time it was the trip was canceled due to COVID. So in the first study that I'm going to report today, this is a cross-sectional study. Here you see data that went into the analysis on more than 2,000 observation hours on 84 subjects, out of which 50 were female, and covering the age range of 4 to 30 years. And here are some specifics on the statistical models that we used. I'm not reporting all the full details. You can read them up in the papers if you're interested. And this is how we present the data. This is simply to give you a feel. It's nothing social. Here we only looked at the locomotor activities. So physical activity like climbing, running, heavily demanding activities, how that varied in relation to age. And the violet circles are the females and the green triangles are the males. And you see the estimated means also with the confidence intervals. And I am sometimes referring to animals as being young or middle-aged or old. So these are the categories. Young would be up to 10 years and middle-aged between 10 and 20 years. And then above 20 years old. But please note that in all of the statistical models, we used age as a continuous predictor variable. And here are some of the papers. So what I'm presenting now is the comparison by Eva Maria Radke of males and females. And that work builds on the initial work by Laura Almeling on females only. So here now we also have the comparison for males and females, and that doesn't occur so frequently. We had quite a number of studies, often small sample sizes, that looked at age-related changes in female behavior, but now we can also put the males into the picture here. And for instance, in terms of locomotor activity, it's perhaps not so surprising that males tend to be more active physically than females, especially when they're young. But what we were really interested in was the social behavior. So this here is social grooming. So the male sitting here is combing through the fur of the female who looks like she's enjoying it. And grooming for us is the key variable to measure the quality of the relationship. So we assume that animals that groom frequently and for long times are also friends, if you will. So they are often strong bond partners. They groom each other and so on. So grooming is the key basis of looking at social relationships. And here's a social network in which we looked at how sociality changes with age. This is based on grooming received. The squares are the males and the circles are the females. And then the age is colored in different shades of blue, with very light being the young animals and dark the old animals. And if you look closely at this network, then you see that young males tend to be peripheral in the social network, or very old males also peripheral in the social network, whereas middle-aged females and males are in the center. This is just descriptive. More interesting for us was then the statistical evaluation. And this slide here shows active grooming. On the left-hand side, the amount of grooming given, and then on the right-hand side, the number of partners that people had. That is how many animals they groomed actively. And in terms of out strength or the amount of grooming given, please note there is a logarithmic scale. So there is quite a dramatic variation in relation to age, with younger animals grooming more frequently than old animals, and females also being socially more active than males. In terms of the number of partners, we see an inverted U here with animals in mid-age having the largest number of partners, and females again having more partners than males. When we look around, turn the perspective around, look at passive grooming, looks very similar. Females, again, receive grooming more frequently than males do, but there's a substantial decrease in relation to age. Older animals receive grooming much less frequently than younger females. And in terms of the number of partners, a similar picture emerges, with animals in their prime receiving most of the grooming. What we also noted is that females tend to be spatially more reclusive. Whereas for males, there is no substantial age change. This is just bordering on significance, the interaction, but this is what we got out of this model here. Okay, so taken together, there are clear age-related changes in social interactions, and older subjects seem to focus on a few meaningful partners. For females, we also know that they have fewer grooming sessions, but they tend to be longer on average. And similar findings were made for chimpanzees in a publication led by Alexa Rosati, published last year in Science. So what we were interested in is now whether older subjects also have a lower interest in social information. That is, if they have a reduced social life, is this because they're generally less interested in their society, in the interactions, or are they simply avoiding the interactions but still want to know what is going on in their society? And to do this, we conducted an experiment in which we measured social interest. This is building on previous work of our group led by Andrea Schell here. This is one of our many no-frills experiments. So I hope I will convince you during the talk that good old behavioral observations and some simple experiments can tell you quite a bit about what matters to the animals. Okay, so in this setup, what happens is there's a photograph of a monkey, a conspecific, and the experimenter sits behind this picture and records the behavior of the subject on video. Before the photograph is shown, the picture is covered, and once an animal approaches to a certain distance, then the cover is lifted. And in this condition here, we had three different in this experiment here, we had three different conditions, pictures depicting infants, a picture of a close friend, or a picture of a non-friend in a paired repeated measures design. And to give you a feel of how this looks like, so here you have a female sitting on one of those benches, and now the cover is lifted. And what she's doing is she's lip smacking and teeth chattering, and these are greeting behaviors. So she's actually looking at the picture of an infant. It turned out afterwards, the experimenter was always blind to the condition. But in this case, it turned out afterwards that this was an infant and she's greeting the infant. And of course, as an ethologist, you think, yeah, the infant is indeed a releaser. And she's responding to it with quite some interest, obviously. When we measured the looking time towards the pictures, we found that across the board, infants elicited the highest interest, but there was also still a significant difference in the amount of time spent looking at a picture of a friend compared to a non-friend. But there was no effect of age. The animals were just as interested in either their friends or an infant when they were old as their other group members who were young were. So we did not see any evidence here for a decrease in the interest in social information, despite the fact that the animals had fewer interactions overall. And we did another approach to measure social interest, which was a playback study. So the animals were exposed to either the screams of a friend or the screams of a non-friend. And then looking time was measured again from the videos of the behavior in the animals in the experiment. And there was a strong effect here. Animals were much more interested in the screams of close friends compared to non-friends. And again, there was no age effect. So we had two different types of evidence for the claim that social interest is high, remains high into old age, although social interactions are less frequently observed in older animals. And the third piece of evidence here is commenting. So that's a really quirky behavior by the Barbary macaques. They utter very specific vocalizations, the kind of raspberry vocalizations when they're observing interactions between third parties. These may involve handling of an infant or a aggressive interaction between third parties, and they sit there and comment on it. And we didn't see any age-related variation in the commenting behavior. So there was no significant effect here of age on the frequency to comment on what's going on in the surroundings. So again, supporting the view that social interest remains high into old age. Now, we were asking ourselves, okay, they're still interested in social information, but they do interact less frequently. If we look, take out our magnifying glass and look at the regulation of the interactions in more detail, do we find evidence that monkeys show a similar effect as humans in terms of avoiding negative affect and high arousal? This is what the SAVI model predicts. And the data set consisted of more than 3,000 signals given by 83 signalers, 250 receivers. And this allowed us to look at the contingency between signaling and responses in detail. So the first question we asked was, are older subjects more likely to ignore signals by others? So if you look at the signal response relationship here, we are focusing on the receivers. And we had assumed that, or we had hypothesized that older subjects would be more likely to ignore signals by others. So for instance, somebody threatens an old monkey, and then the monkey just stares to the ground and pretends as if nothing has happened. And so that's one way of trying to avoid an escalation of the situation. And we also predicted, of course, as an interaction with signal types. So we did not expect them necessarily to respond less to affiliative signals. And here are the data. And there was no effect. There was no interaction. We didn't find the predicted interaction. And we also did not find a main effect of receiver age or signal type here. So no evidence for a greater propensity to ignore signals by others, and in this way try to avoid further interactions. We then looked at the other contingency. So are signals by older subjects more likely to be ignored? So now the subjects are the signalers, and then we looked at the propensity to respond in the others. And here we see quite some convincing evidence for the fact that both the affiliative signals of older monkeys and the aggressive signals of older monkeys are more likely to be ignored by others. So the probability to respond goes down for both signal categories. So no effect of signal type, but a clear effect of age here. And this suggests that older subjects become less important to others. We also looked at the avoidance of negative social information experimentally, again with the fancy looking time paradigm with photographs. And in this case, we had pairs of pictures depicting the same subject, either displaying an aggressive facial expression or a neutral facial expression, both for males and females. Altogether, we tested 47 subjects. Each subject saw a maximum of 2 pairs. And altogether, ultimately, we had 177 trials for analysis. And we predicted that older animals should be more likely to avoid the aggressive signal. And we found no such effect. There was no difference in looking time towards the aggressive or the neutral picture. And there was also no age effect and no significant interaction. So no evidence here for the avoidance of negative social information in Barbary macaques. And there is another study in rhesus monkeys, also conducted by Alexa Rosati. And what they found in the rhesus monkeys was that overall older monkeys were less prone or less likely to look at the photos, but this loss of interest was attenuated for the male threat photo. So they still looked at the male threat photo, but otherwise interest declined. And so there is, although the experiments were actually quite similar in terms of the setup with males and females and the threat phase and so on, we found not the same result. So taken together, neither the Barbary macaque study nor the rhesus monkey study provided evidence for avoidance or ignorance of negative social information in old age. And if you read further, the emotional trajectories are also not so clear in humans. So there is this narrative of people being more satisfied with life when they're older, but that's not necessarily the case. There's a recent study published by Jeb et al. In Psych Science. They asked more than 1.7 million people worldwide, and they looked at different dimensions, namely positive affect, life satisfaction, and negative affect. And they found mainly a decrease in positive affect with age, but no changes in life satisfaction and negative affect. So again, this is an arena where we probably need to look carefully at the different studies and look why they differ in terms of the results, and also look at sample sizes. So for the monkeys, we can conclude, although social activity declines, social interest remains stable, and that kind of rings a bell, I think. And perhaps we find similar evidence if you would ask the people the same questions, and look at what they say, what they're still interested in, and then what they do. Maybe we'll find actually similar evidence for people, I don't know. What we were interested in next was whether this continuous interest in information that we saw in the monkeys, whether this is domain general or specific to the social domain. So do they generally find the rest of the world less interesting when they get older, and only retain the social interest, or is this a domain general, and they basically are still interested in almost everything around them? So what we did is we did a novel object study here. This is again a little clip. On the right-hand side, you see the monkey. It's a subadult male, and he will be confronted with a novel object, and then you can see what he's doing. So this is our fancy cube with shimmer and glitter inside, and now he sits there, and that's on top of a gorge. And we were really worried at this point that he will throw the cube down the cliff, and that would have been it with the cube, but he didn't. But he held on to the cube for quite a while, and after that, Laura decided to tie all the objects she presented to the monkeys to some tree, so that we wouldn't run the danger of, losing some of the objects down in that gorge here, in the beautiful gorge of Rocamadour. So that would be an example for an animal showing interest in a novel object. And we had two different types. So we had the cube, and then we had toys, also different types of toys, and we measured the interest in these toys. And then there was also a novel object that was contained a food reward. So this is this tube here. It's also a plexiglass tube, and both ends of the tube are closed with sticky paper, and inside the transparent tube are peanuts, 2 peanuts. And then again, the measure was the latency. How long did it take for the animals to approach the objects, and how long did they handle it, and whether then successful to retrieve the nut in this case, or the nuts. And this is an old female sitting in the background. And now let's see what happens. Yeah, this is how no interest looks like. So she's just folding her little arms, and that's about it. So she didn't approach the tube and didn't even try to open it. And these graphs here show the exploration time within the first 2 minutes after presentation of the object. And what is pretty clear is that both for the toys and the cube, the interest is only high in young animals. And once animals are older than 10 years, there's only very little interest still. So the dramatic change is between adolescence and young adulthood, when people, or monkeys in this case, become reproductively active. Things look different in the tube experiment. So here interest is high into old age, but the very old animals around 25 and younger, they couldn't be bothered anymore. So we found a significant interaction here between object type and age. So reward matters, but simply trying to learn something about the world, there the key difference or the key change in life history happens much earlier. So for the tube, we looked in more detail also at the success rate. Of course, here there's a lower sample size because only 53 animals handled the tube. And animals older than 20 were unsuccessful in opening it at all. And there was a clear age effect for proportion success. And for those animals that were able to open it, we also could determine latency, and latency went up with age. So the monkeys became clumsier and ultimately less successful. And then, of course, you ask yourself, well, whether the very old animals that did not even approach the tube knew they were not able to do this. And therefore, but we don't know, of course, you know, that I'm now hand waving. All right, and the next study we did was on, we continued our investigation of problem solving. So with a tube, that was quite interesting. And Eva Maria Radke, as part of her PhD thesis, created these boxes here to investigate impulse inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and persistence. And on the left-hand side, there's this wooden box, and the box contains a plexiglass box, and the plexiglass cube is closed at the front side. And what the animals had to do is reach around either on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, that was varying, to get at a peanut that was sitting in the middle of the transparent cube. And we measured the latency and the success rate. In the middle was the cognitive flexibility task. So there is a kind of, we call it the cupboard. It's a cupboard with two doors, with two sliding doors, and a peanut is placed behind one of the sliding doors, but that door is closed or locked. It cannot be opened. And the animals, again, have to reach around. They have to figure out they have to open the other door and then reach around to get the nut. And on the right-hand side is the persistence task. So there's a cylinder. It contains 2 nuts. And the cylinder is locked. It cannot be opened. You can turn it and turn it and turn it and turn it, but you will not get at the nut. And the question here was, how long do the animals persist in turning this cylinder until they finally give up? And 99 subjects were tested in each of these tasks. And the most notable finding was similar as in the tube. The likelihood to engage in the task was lower for older monkeys than for younger ones in all of the 3 tasks. So clearly the motivation to engage in any of these tasks was varied with age quite dramatically. Now, if you think that these are simple experiments, then you think like me. Before we started these, I thought, well, that's not so difficult, but it turns out we are actually exploring the limits of what the animals can do. So here, this is the inhibitory control task. There was no age effect here, although you may argue, well, there are a few data points here, but overall, this result was not significant. That was not what we had predicted. What we had predicted was that younger and older individuals should take a little bit lower to reach around, because you have to suppress your impulse to just, reach out. And so they should need longer to reach around, but this is not what we found. We found overall that the animals needed quite some time, and quite a number actually of these animals failed. So of the 83 animals that participated, only 54 retrieved the nut, and the other animals didn't even participate, who were presented with this box. So our prediction was not supported by the data. In the cognitive flexibility task, it was even worse. We had predicted that flexibility decreases with age. Of the 79 subjects that participated, only 21 opened the door, and of these, only 9 were actually able to retrieve the nut. And so for the 21 animals that opened the door, we could look at the latency, but there was no significant effect. So very hard to interpret here, actually. And certainly our prediction was not met. And only in terms of persistence, where everybody who participated became, successful in a sense, our prediction was that persistence decreases with age, and that was true. Of the 87 subjects that participated, we found that older animals were more likely to stop or earlier than younger individuals. So yes, and that's not surprising, given that the older animals are overall less motivated. It's also not surprising that in the persistence task, which is essentially also a motivation task, they give up earlier. So in summary, we found good evidence for the claim that motivation to engage in tasks declines with age, clear evidence that persistence declines. We couldn't find evidence for an age effect for impulse inhibition. And for cognitive flexibility, I would say this is difficult to judge in terms of age effects, but overall it seems that this is really, at the limit of what the animals can routinely and quickly do. Overall, I think these findings stress the importance of motivation for performance. So when we look at performance, we always have to look at both the ingredients, motivation and cognitive ability. And motivation certainly plays a huge role in these kinds of settings where the animals are not thirsty or hungry to work for solving the problem. So I think motivation, it teaches us a lesson about motivation. In summary, we see these major motivational changes across the lifespan, but they are differentiated for different domains. There's an early loss of motivation to explore the world, unless there's a food reward. Older animals are also apparently less motivated to engage in social interactions. They focus on fewer partners, but this is not just the result of a limited future time perspective. So there seems to be a more deeply rooted change in motivation to engage in social interactions, which of course can be costly when you're older, because any of these interactions could also turn ugly. And so perhaps that is a reason why the animals are less eager to engage in a physical interaction. And the withdrawal from society is not due to loss of interest in social information. So it's not as if the animals are entirely withdrawing from the society. It is as if they're regulating the interactions mostly by avoiding an interaction, but otherwise they're still following what's happening in their club. And I think this change in the propensity to engage in an interaction has a lot to do with the variation or changes in costs and benefits of social interactions with age. In summary, I think we can conclude at this point that motivational changes with age have deep biological roots, and probably what we see in humans is a combination of the two. We see on the one hand changes that are due to changes in physiology, senescence. This is shared with non-human primates. And then in addition, we are aware of our limited future time. And we know this from the experiments in humans, because, for instance, when you move to Australia or move to a different place, you also still have a limited time. And then you think harder about how you're still going to spend that time in the place where you still are. This is not excluding this effect, but I think it suggests strongly that there are two sources why older people change their preferences. And also, I think these findings highlight the importance of age-related changes in the reward system. So what do we value? Changes clearly with the life history stage at which we are at. So when you're young, it pays off to be risk-prone, to explore new things, because you still have a lot to gain. Whereas when you're older, the issue is rather trying to avoid losses. And this fits very nicely with, our findings fit very nicely with this view proposed by Baltes and Freund in their theoretical contributions. And this brings me to the final slide. I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for bearing with me online. I think most of us have had it, but I still hope you enjoyed a little bit. And then, of course, I want to thank Laura Almeling and Eva Maria Radke for being such splendid PhD students, Alexandra Freund from the University of Zurich for the many discussions we had about old age, Kurt Hammerschmidt, Holger Senhen-Reulen, and Roger Munri for statistical advice, and Kurt for also helping with the experiment. And again, Ellen Merz, Gilbert, and Guillaume de Turckheim for permission to work in the park, the staff at Rocamadour for their friendly and patient support, and the funders for funding all of this. Thank you.